Hi, I'm Monica Williams with USDA's Agricultural Research Service, and we're excited about the 2024 Olympics and Paralympics. So much so that we have two special guests with us today. Dr. Ian Shultis, who is the USA fencing team physical therapist and athletic trainer, and we also have James Cain, who is a registered dietitian who works here at USDA. And we want to get their perspective on nutrition and diet and activities and how they are each linked to high performance competitions for athletics. How important is diet and nutrition in conjunction with U.S. athletes' training schedules?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can say just how, walking with a couple of these teams over the years, it really comes down to like, that's just their daily, their fuel for what they're going to be doing daily. And now with the teams themselves, it's not that they're doing stuff, their 8 hour day is not just training the whole day. They'll have, 2 hour chunks or whatnot. So it's set up to solve those very focused, very deliberate training sessions. And so it's honestly the main thing that's giving them the energy and the focus to be able to do their training for that day and what it is they're trying to accomplish out of that, or if it's leading up to a tournament coming down to the future. So I think overall, it's really just that is, you can't have one without the other. That with what they're doing, either one is it their training in terms of when their team, or is it also the strength and conditioning walk, or recovery day in that aspect. So, there might be some different focuses based on energy systems that they're going to be utilizing versus say someone who's just doing a typical 9 to 5 and going to the gym later on. So I think maybe what's different with it is it's more focused on what fuel sources am I going to be using for my training effort today. Am I doing a double effort today? Am I just doing more things? Or is it focused on speed and agility? Is it a competition? I'm going to have an 8+ hour day, then the nutrition needs will be a little bit different. So I guess it's more just selection of what it is I'm taking in, putting it prior to an effort like that maybe some folks maybe wouldn't think about on a day-to-day type basis. So it's like, what type of fuel is it that I'm selecting? And maybe the timing of it is a bit more specific toward athletes.
Yeah, those are some great points. I'm thinking about a general population just being physically active. I would say recreational athletes. Some recreational athletes can be quite competitive, but for most individuals being physically active, it just comes down to consuming a balanced diet, carbs, fats, and proteins, making sure that there aren't really long stretches without food. But nutrient timing, like Dr. Schultz is mentioning, is just not as much of a concern for people being just generally active for health and personal fitness. So the overall quality of the diet helps overall fitness and recovery. And then as an individual becomes more competitive, longer training sessions, more intense, then those sports nutrition principles become more important.
Does their diet and nutritional intake change with their competitions that lead up to the Summer Olympics?
Yeah, so this is interesting maybe based on the discipline of the athlete you're looking at. Back in the beginning, it was only a few weeks ago, we had the U.S. Olympic trials for both track and field, gymnastics, swimming. I work with USA Fencing, and all Olympic qualification takes place about a year and a half. It's a whole rolling points system. So they don't necessarily have one big event that they'll gearing up for as much as just the whole World Cup circuit prior to that. So I think in their perspective, it's almost more so, okay, they have to kind of maintain that system that's going to work for them, for that whole entire one, the international competition, but also there's that added emphasis and stressor of how now this is for Olympic qualification. And then obviously the weeks before the Olympics, athletes will have more training camps. They're going to have more just practicing in general. So those changes would be maybe a bit more emphasized. So just to match at least, okay, well, I'm adding on some extra volume and workload now. I need to account for that somehow. That's not just coming out of thin air. So there is definitely a shift, the focus of, okay, what's my training load like at this point? Versus, hey, I have to compete a whole season for, a year before the Olympics to make that qualification process happen. I kind of need to make sure I have a system in place that's going to get me through that.
I think a theme we'll see is that what applies to elite athletes like the Olympians, it applies to generally recreational individuals, but on a much smaller scale. So instead of like these year-long, 4-year-long, month-long training phases, it might be like, hey, maybe I've got a long hike this weekend, or it was really hot outside and I lost a lot of fluid through some sweat. And so just thinking about, hey, let me plan my dinner for what I'm going to do tomorrow, or maybe let me recover because I plan on doing like maybe a 2-day hiking trip, little things like that. So it's kind of like on a smaller scale, but kind of similar principles.
What food categories do athletes most likely lean toward to maintain their energy level needed to perform?
This is obviously going to differ per the discipline of the sport that you're doing and what your energy requirements are. When I think about fencing, we have long days. You can be there at 7 a.m. in the morning, and you might be there to 7, 8 p.m. in the evening. Now, it's not constant. You're not running a marathon this whole time, but you'll have short exposure to things. You have a lot of time off. So a lot of times, I definitely see athletes utilizing, initially, carbohydrates in the morning, especially for those quicker matches where you might have 5 to 10 minutes in between, but then you are coming back up. And it's more so just about those are usually always in the beginning of the day. So, if they haven't had time to, they'll eat a breakfast in the morning of a bit more mixed composition. But usually in the event, I usually see people relying on usually carbohydrates, in the event itself. They're usually always supplementing with some type of electrolyte or sodium source. It might be a mixed nut to also get some fats in as well, or just an electrolyte mix in the drink. Fencing, we do often tend to see some cramping instances as the day goes on. Especially just with all the equipment they wear, they are sweating. And although it's not the main, it's not the main causative factor of clamps, it is associative, at least if people can keep up some hydration and keep up some electrolyte and sodium intake, that generally tends to do a little bit better on that presentation. So overall, I'd like to say it's a little bit of a mixed component of what fuel sources they are taking in. Largely carbohydrates in the moment because it's relatively short, quick, and then they have time off to kind of recover. And then in the middle of the day, they might just go get something that anyone would have access to, a sandwich, a baked good at the little cafe that's down the street from the venue. As opposed to maybe a big meal, though, obviously. Some small glazing type efforts throughout the day as they continue to compete.
Yeah, for people that are just being generally active or even recreational athletes, similar principles, but so really, I guess what to think about is that carbohydrates are going to fuel those really high intensity and long duration activities. And while a lot of people think, maybe I should limit carbohydrates, they're bad, it's really oversimplified. And a lot of people really are thinking about added sugars. But even then, a lot of athletes will focus on added sugars because they're burning just so many calories and they need that really quick refueling. But that's not necessarily appropriate for someone who's just being generally active for health. So a mixed diet with carbohydrates like whole grains, fruits, vegetables included in normal meals will fuel most individuals. And then they could think about, if their training session or their exercise session, they're feeling a little weak or dizzy, they could even think, well, maybe I'll do a little snack beforehand, especially if it's first thing in the morning. So a lot of it's just individual, but really a balanced diet is going to serve most people.
What type of foods do many of them avoid prior to competition? Do they have to be wary of carbs, sugars, salt intake, for example?
Yeah. So we touched a little bit on carbs and salt, like in the event as they're going, because they're ultimately trying to get kind of that somewhat consistent stream in throughout the day, because they're going to have that high effort and then they're going to have some time down. So they're generally trying to get those type of food sources in. And then again, I will see people also taking in, a healthy fat as the day goes on. Usually in a mix, I'm thinking of things mostly like mixed nuts or whatnot. They might be able to get some type of almost like some like preserved meats, like a beef jerky or something like that, that will have a little bit of that will also provide some protein in between for some when they have more time down. Typically, I think, especially if we travel, say, to an international location, we avoid street foods. We avoid very greasy foods, especially the day before the event. Usually we get in, we try to go to a grocery store and pick up some foods that we're familiar with. So not to change and add too many variables in. So sometimes you're in a very extravagant, a very different place and you want to be able to try everything, but that's maybe not the time to try something new the day before a World Cup. So, we'll save some of those experiences for after the event, an after event meal. But we try to avoid some of those more maybe risky foods in some aspect and stick somewhat to what we know. I wouldn't say though avoiding maybe a food group per se, except maybe not something that is ultimately very greasy or high in saturated fats that might cause some gastric distress. And we'll stick to some more common foods.
Yeah, those are great points. I think an easy takeaway is I would say just don't eat a salad before you go exercise. It's not going to send the stomach very well. If it's like 30 minutes beforehand. So yeah, definitely going for the little bit simpler foods that a little easier to digest before those exercise sessions. And I think that applies to a lot of people, even just going to local gym.
How intertwined is nutrition with recovery? From a athletic standpoint, how important is it to keep our bodies functioning the way we need them to?
We think of nutrition as fuel. Obviously, if we're an athlete burning thousands of calories, that fuel component becomes really important, but it applies to everybody. And if someone is not eating enough or they're not eating at the right times, so they're not fueling before their activities, especially if they're really long or intense, or they're not recovering afterwards, they, again, they're a little bit more susceptible to injury. Their body isn't going to repair as much. People think about muscle mass. It's not just about muscle mass. It's about the connective tissue. It's about our immune system. A lot of these things we need to be adequately fueled in order to have just really an integrated recovery response that goes beyond just muscle. It's a little bit more whole body. But also we know that there's something called the gut-brain axis. Again, some great USDA research is that what we eat affects our gut bacteria, and the gut bacteria in response to nutrition and the environment affect our brain. And so nutrition plays a huge role in mood, recovery, our focus, as well as the sleep quality. And all those things also feed back into our digestion. So people can think, if they're kind of overly stressed or overly doing it, like their stomach doesn't feel great. So again, that kind of two-way street. And so, a lot of individuals, including people just being recreationally active, will focus on nutrition for fuel, but that's why we try to promote just a generally healthy diet, just because no matter how much you need for fuel, the basic healthfulness of the overall diet pattern plays a huge role in just being generally healthy and I guess resilient to the stress of exercise so that you can actually get the benefits of adapting to that exercise.
I don't think I have too much else to add on it, but I think just to maybe a point we put in before is how sometimes you may be, and you designate yourself as an athlete, to whatever extent that is. And we can always think like, we can always utilize those maybe quick, fast burning sugars. But yeah, you do have to look at the quality of maybe what's that overarching diet and where that food source quality coming into is coming out. You can always say, I'm exercising a bunch today. I can maybe eat a little bit unhealthier. And part of that might be true from an energy expenditure, but I think the point you put on the gut-brain axis, like that is stuff that it's like, well, that really matters. What are you doing the majority of the time? So can't always use the excuse how, if I'm an athlete, I can eat whatever I want, right? It's like, everyone's got to think about these things. We're all human in that aspect.
It's interesting, and I was watching one of the USDA Go for Gold videos with some of the athletes talking about their diet. And, I've heard this over and over, whether it be especially like the local gym or local groups of, people I walk with, but especially in athletes, the older they get, the more nutrition seems to make a difference. Your body just becomes a little bit more sensitive to the little aches and pains or the recovery. So, but again, if you get started earlier, you're just going to get more benefit, but it's definitely important as people get older.
We always hear hydrate, hydrate, hydrate with the heat of summer. How do you know the correct amount of fluids needed based on your activities? When should you choose a product with electrolytes over water?
Yeah, the general advice is if an individual, be it an athlete or anyone recreational, if you're doing intense sessions or really long sessions, say over an hour, hour and a half, and you have a really high sweat rate, generally if you're just dripping sweat, you probably need to think about purposely adding some kind of fluid and especially some electrolytes some sodium mostly. So if you look on the label, it'll say sodium. Some add other things like potassium and magnesium. Those aren't as important. So just getting something with some electrolytes and some fluid that you're purposely sipping every 10, 15, 20 minutes, depending on the activity, throughout that hour, hour and a half. Longer sessions, definitely. How does someone know it's enough? Now, for a high level athlete, especially like, say, a runner or someone who's doing really long training sessions, that has to be sometimes a little bit more planned. But for someone who's just going to go for a long hike or a bike ride or just go work out in the garden, but they're just sweating a lot, to some extent, if it's somewhat lower intensity activity, drinking to thirst works for most people. And then over time, as long as there are meals, and when I say over time, like over the course of the day after that session, or multiple days, especially if someone's outside regularly, is making sure that we're just sipping water throughout the day and making sure that the color of urine is just like a light yellow. It shouldn't be totally clear, shouldn't be too dark. Just something kind of a nice pale straw yellow is the recommendation to say that someone's adequately hydrated. And making sure that the diet has fruits and vegetables. Those have a lot of water content as well. So it's not just about drinking fluids all the time. We can also get those from foods.
How important is sleep or taking a day off from training for, say, an upcoming run or your routine workout?
I think we're getting more evidence these days that sleep is a critical component to health and performance, whether that be at work, or emotional regulation for our general well-being, or just feeling alert and motivation. And I think we've all had some experience of trying to do something active while being tired, and it's just not as fun. So if I want a sustainable workout program, even just hobbies that might be working in the backyard, doing some gardening, going for walks with friends, if I'm rested, I'm enjoying it better. And of course, we also know that being well rested is going to just be overall healthier, supports a healthy immune system, supports better digestion, better mood. Obviously every major chronic disease has some aspect of poor sleep contributing to that. So, to the extent that it both makes me feel better, improves my performance, and it's healthy, it's definitely a priority.
Yeah, and I can think of the obvious example might be like, hey, if we're traveling overseas for a competition, everyone's clock is all messed up, right? With time changes. And that's obvious. You kind of have to do your best to kind of catch up. We usually always get there a few days early. Some athletes even arrive even earlier than the majority of like our recommended window. They might get there 3 to 4 days ahead of time. And I believe the typical recommendation is at least about a day for an hour before you finally adjust in. But going to Europe, that's at least six days at a time. So they try to manage sleep on the flight is always kind of an important key, I think. And then if we arrive and say we went eastward, we'll try not to, depending on what time you arrive in the daytime, it's like you try to make sure you can stay up until the evening and go to bed early and then start your day as close to normal as possible. But I think maybe the more equitable sense to that an everyday person is almost when an athlete maybe have a training camp, they try to program in a quick little nap in between, and which is obviously it's a luxury for I can think of most people. I always think we need more naps just on a normal 8-day walk day, but that's always something that they prioritize is we'll do a 2-hour training session. People will get a meal and then they'll take a nap for 20, 30 minutes, and then even if there's an afternoon training session or even if it's just hanging out for the rest of the day, it's like then you get that extra little bit of recovery and it can go a long way for even if there's not a second training session, but that's now going to set you up well onto the next day. So you can't say enough about trying to get on a good sleep cycle, either traveling or with high stress with training.
Do you have any tips for how we can build up to include a more active routine and balanced diet?
Small steps. It doesn't sound exciting, but most changes that actually stick long term are just a series of really small steps. And so it could be, think about, I'm going to set a goal that's too small to fail. Like I'm going to do just one small thing. If it's like, hey, I'm going to go, walk outside. I'm just going to walk the other block and back. If I want to walk further, I will, but I don't have to. And then that just gets you into the routine and the habit. And then it becomes easier to build onto that. Or I'm going to make sure that I eat one baby carrot a day. That's like my start to add more vegetables in my diet. And then, you can maybe make it 2 the next week. And so, but then you get exposed to the flavors, the routine. And so I think a lot of people underestimate just habit, and slowly exposing ourselves to things over time, whether that be changes in diet, sleep schedule, physical activity. It's just a really good approach to a lot of these.
I think, I mean, one point I mentioned before that I thought of is, like having a goal or something that you're working toward can then direct a lot of ways those habits tend to form from that day to day. And in some aspect, giving you some sense of accountability of like, this is why I'm trying to make these changes. But even if it's something like, I even thought like, even it's like, okay, what's your habit when you go food shopping? It's like, what section of the store do you go to first? And some of those small things that you can kind of do, and to be, okay, can I pick up a few extra raw vegetables I'm going to try to find a way to cook or incorporate into my meal this week and have available so I can use them, as opposed to reaching for something a little bit easier. So, but I would think, from an activity perspective, I think it's always helpful to have a goal, something that you're working toward. It doesn't need to be anything huge. And I think small, like you said, is too small to fail is a great way. It's like then you just get a little reinforcement each step at a time and can give you something to work toward.